Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss Chomsky and Moldbug, and who in this sort of hypothetical debate is right, and in particular the issue of private power and democracy. Tim, this was your sort of idea with the whole Chomsky versus Moldbug. So how did you come to this debate, theoretical one in your head?
If you clicked on this video expecting the real life version of Moldbug versus Chomsky, then one will be disappointed. I don't have those kind of connections, and even if I did, I don't think either of them would necessarily agree to do it. But nonetheless, this is in the traditional model of there's a book called Paine versus Burke. Dallas Willard, of course, has Nietzsche versus Christ in one of his books. And MacIntyre does this with like Nietzsche versus Aristotle. Take two thinkers of a time period or historically, and then see what a debate or discussion between them would look like. In a way, this has already happened with Chomsky versus Foucault. But nonetheless, today will be Moldbug versus Chomsky. Moldbug's real name, of course, is Curtis Yarvin, but I'll just refer to him as Moldbug. In this regard, I think both Moldbug and Chomsky get to the heart of one of the central debates in modern political life, which is democracy and private versus political power, or power in general. Before I get to what they disagree about, and I'd say the crux of their disagreement hinges on the relationship democracy has to private and public power, and whether private or public power exists, and whether democracy exists. But before I get to what they disagree about, I'm going to get to what they agree about. And I think one thing remarkable about the two of them is they have both life factors of similarities, and they both have lots of agreements. So I'm going to list what I think they agree with. Both Chomsky and Moldbug view the current U.S., and for that matter, Britain, Australia, the West in general. As Sean Gebb himself pointed out in an earlier episode, is the British and Canada, they're all subservient to the United States, and in some ways they're their own local ruling elites, but nonetheless, they view them as oligarchies. Both Chomsky and Moldbug view the United States as an oligarchy. It's not a democracy. You get this with Chomsky too. Chomsky wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. He actually co-wrote it. But nonetheless, the manufacturing book is a book that explains the book Manufacturing Consent. You don't even need to read it in a way. I've read a few chapters of it once in college, and I've done some looking at it. But nonetheless, it's a great book. It explains itself. Alex Jones could have written the book. In some way, Alex Jones is a downstream version of Manufacturing Consent, and actually, the Alex Jones of the anti-Bush years is clearly related to that. That's where Alex Jones actually met Joe Rogan protesting 9/11. And actually, that's one of the things in the book Manufacturing Consent. It's sort of the propaganda model of the media. So the corporate press is the ruling apparatus. The corporate press is the ruling apparatus where consent to the oligarchical state is manufactured. And this, of course, is propped up by the media and the state universities. And the corporate press, again, is largely a corporate press. It's CNN, New York Times, BBC, and all NPR. They're all state media or media. They're not grassroots media. This is not. Although there are great journalists that work there, in general, it's unclear whether the New York Times or the BBC is in charge, or is the U.S. government. And there's a close relationship between the pair, and there's been a close relationship with pair for a long time in the United States. I don't know the history as well of other states, but like during the U.S. Civil War and during World War I, there was heavy editorial control of major newspapers in the United States. So in that regard, there's a close relationship, and the media and the education system. And this is what Moldbug would call the cathedral. So I think it's interesting that they both end up in sort of two sides of the moon, drilling to the same sort of general idea. Now, of course, they have different worldviews or different ideals, possibly. But nonetheless, I would say that Chomsky's idea of the sort of propaganda model and Moldbug's cathedral are very similar. And as far as the thinkers themselves, why I chose them, I chose Chomsky because Chomsky is an influence in the West. without question. I mean, he's probably the number one living left-wing political philosopher, social philosopher out there. I mean, there's no one close. He's the Bertrand Russell of our time, for better or for worse. I mean, he is getting older in that regard. That he might be getting a little more eccentric, but nonetheless, he's central. His influence can't be, if you want to dismiss him as a linguist. Although, interesting enough, his linguism, as a conservative friend once pointed out to me, that his linguistic theory implies an intelligent designer, funnily enough. But nonetheless, that's just red meat for the listeners there. But that's just myself. But nonetheless, Chomsky's a linguist. He's a political activist, and so forth. But nonetheless, the Moldbug is obvious because now Moldbug is less famous in that regard, in the famous scale. But I could have chose other thinkers. I could have chose Hans Hoppe. I could have chose Murray Rothbard. I could have chose a few others to juxtapose to Chomsky. But I think Moldbug is interesting because Moldbug takes the ideas of not only Hoppe, and in his interview with Thaddeus Russell, Moldbug does cite Hoppe as a Quake author. It's not just Mosk and James Buchanan, but Moldbug in a way ties together Hoppe, James Buchanan, and Mosk and the old right, the old European right, and puts them in a sort of package. And of course, Moldbug is not an activist in that regard. In this regard, I think Rothbard's more of an activist, and Hans Hoppe is at the heart is more just an economist, German economist. And Hoppe himself has sort of a background issue where he was a Frankfurt School-trained Marxist in that regard under Habermas. So I would argue Moldbug, by virtue of being an American, by virtue of having sort of broad political, not just political background of thinkers, puts it together the old right tradition, and as well as the libertarian influences. And I think libertarian as a movement has a problem where it leaks. And it leaks, and now I personally don't care about this as much. In this regard, it leaks towards the Chomsky left libertarian camp, for better or worse. And with the early Rothbard, you can clearly see this. Early Rothbard, somewhat new left. Chomsky is arguably vaguely new left. So in that regard, I think Moldbug, by being more firmly in the Mosk, the Italian school political tradition of James Buchanan, it's much more in that regard. So that's why I chose those two thinkers to sort of have debate. So that's in general what they agree about in theory. They also, by the way, are both secular Jews. They both are living in America. They both like Biden. This is another interesting thing. Both are very happy about Biden. Now, Moldbug is not happy as Chomsky is, but Chomsky had his famous "Your kids will be underwater if you don't vote for Biden" speech, which I think is one of those hilarious political things that will probably not age very well. But nonetheless, they do have similar social outlooks in that regard. But of course, they're working from different sides of the moon, so to speak. I don't think that I think that has to be known in advance. So those are argue are what they agree about. Now I'm going to get to what I would say the differences, and this is where I'm going to then I'm going to pass it to you, Swithin, and see if they agree about this. But the differences, and the key difference is democracy and its viability and whether we want it. Moldbug doesn't think democracy is a good idea, and not only doesn't he think it's a good idea, he thinks it's a bad idea. And Chomsky thinks democracy is a great idea in general. Although interestingly, and this is where Carl Schmitt makes his entry, and this is where another problem comes up with both Moldbug and Chomsky, is that they don't like certain kinds of democracy. If the democracy gets the wrong answers, because we're putting out in 1932. Everyone's favorite boogeyman was elected somewhat democratically. You argue over how democratically it was elected, but nonetheless, it wasn't elected democratically. Now, interestingly, Chomsky himself thinks that the United States is and was never a democracy in any meaningful way, per se. Neither is Moldbug. So in that regard, they both have sort of the same past view. They both have this very dark view of the past. Which comes up in the manufacturing consent. Was the United States a democracy during the Vietnam War under Nixon? In Chomsky's eyes, probably not. And abroad, Chomsky, with books like Killing Hope, which Kevin Carson cites, The United States and Latin America clearly doesn't act democratically, overthrows them. Although of course the Soviet Union would do the same thing. Then we get into the Cold War dispute. But then again, that's neither here nor there. But back, I think that the central disagreement is over whether democracy is viable and whether it's happened. So Swithin, do you agree with me that they have a lot of points of agreement? So Swithin, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that certainly their views as to who runs America, I think would be relatively close. I think it's accurate to say that both of them would treat it as an oligarchy. And although because the history of the past, though, I'm pretty sure Moldbug thinks that America was a democracy at some point historically, or at least that's James Lawrence's interpretation of Moldbug. I think he would say prior to the New Deal that America was sort of a democracy, because before the New Deal you don't really have the managerial revolution in full swing, which you get very much with FDR and the New Deal. And prior to that, it was more focused on sort of Congress and the Senate and House of Representatives to make speeches to persuade their fellow congressmen as to what the law should be. Whereas after the New Deal, things are then sort of dealt with in permanent bureaucracies and things, and it's moved away from the sort of overt political machinery to the less seen bureaucracy, as it were. So I think that is a possible difference. But on their current analysis of the situation, I think they are somewhat similar, although I think Chomsky, at least at present, is probably much more favourably disposed towards the corporate press than Moldbug would be. Which comes on to the Biden win. It's obvious as to why Chomsky would prefer a Biden win to Trump, in a way, although not really when it comes to war. But Chomsky, especially these days, just seems to end up like a typical leftist in that basically we're not really a leftist, we're just pro-Democrat party situation. Whereas Moldbug, I'm not sure exactly why he's written in defense of Biden, but I suspect that it would be it would be because it would show the right, or how should we say, the opponents of the current regime, that actually democratic attempts to achieve democratic power will fail. Trump was probably the example of it trying to work, and now no, Biden's won. Look, you can't do it. You have to focus on something else. And this bleeds into, interestingly, you said that the difference between Chomsky and Moldbug on democracy. One of Moldbug's old ideas was to take control of the to have a complete revolution, as it were, in the United States. Politically speaking, you can't engage in political power because it simply won't work. Anything you do by the corporate press will be reported in a negative light. An obvious example here would be lockdown protests versus BLM reporting. And so Moldbug's idea was you had to create the anti-versity, this sort of independent university which would function as sort of like the anti-cathedral. And it would be recognized as being a great source of wisdom. And this would you basically just wait to the current system to collapse, while everybody else goes, oh look, we should now move our allegiance over to the anti-versity, who will then sort of provide the guiding light for the new society. Because Moldbug has no faith whatsoever in democracy as creating any genuine change, which actually, interestingly, is of course what Chomsky would advocate. Not don't come across any of his particular policy prescriptions, but it's the faith in the voter, faith in the average man in a certain way, and collectively coming together, they'll be able to reshape America for a new egalitarian, in Chomsky's case, anarcho-syndicalist sort of society. So those are sort of some broad opening thoughts on the differences and the similarities with Moldbug and Chomsky.
Well, great. One of the reasons why I picked, you brought up the anarcho-syndicalist point. One of the reasons I picked Chomsky is I'd argue that Chomsky is the purest left-wing thinker out there available. Maybe Kevin Carson, maybe not. I'd say Chomsky. But as far as left-wing thought, that's not Stalinist. His purity there is next to none. One of the Chomsky's comments he brought up was the northern argument. Chomsky was once asked about, what about the good capitalist who takes care of his workers, provides them good pensions and so forth? And he said, I'm paraphrasing. He basically said, that's roughly the northern argument. That's roughly the southern argument for slavery. See, look, these slaveholders, they don't sell them. They provide them housing. They provide them nice wages. And heck, many of them don't even run away. So in that regard, he'd say employment in a way is no different than slavery. It's just sort of wage slavery, and that to me is rather that's a rather pure conception of freedom. Now this gets into the questions like is liberty possible under Chomsky's conception of freedom there. I mean, in that regard, I'm more of a practical person or conservative in that regard. I mean, I'd argue that kind of, if you have a good employer and you can free to choose another good employer or start your own business, are you free or not free? I mean, this is just, I'd say, the central dispute now in political life, and this sort of pure anarcho-syndicalism, which of course his favorite example is the Barcelonians. Of course, they didn't lose to the fascists or the right. Not that they were fascists in any meaningful sense, no more different than FDR was. And you get this in Book Human Smoke. But nonetheless, if you use the Barcelonians, they lost out to the Stalinists. So, the Chomsky ideas of libertarian socialists lose out to the oligarchical socialists, which Orwell perfectly encapsulates in his book 1984, his theory of oligarchical communism, or theory of oligarchical socialism, which is bloody brilliant in terms of just perfectly describing what actual functioning socialist regimes end up doing. They end up functioning like monarchies, and actually Kim Jong-un's regime actually has tended toward being like the worst version of an absolute monarchy with a god king ever imaginable, with obvious propaganda, which would make people like King Louis and the Tsar Nicky would be jealous in a way of the power that they actually have over their citizens' lives, which comes through the media, which comes through, and again, media circa 1950 is still fairly advanced. TV, radio, newspaper, print. You don't just need the internet. You get pretty far with just that. So in that regard, I would argue that Chomsky is fairly pure in his sort of libertarian socialism. He's not a tanky in that regard. But interestingly, as you pointed out, Chomsky does end up being just another corporate Democrat, arguably, which is neither here nor there in some ways. I mean, this might be the trajectory of almost everyone. I mean, this ends up being the trajectory of some Libertarian Party members, arguably. So it's not. Some people might say that's a stretch, but if the Libertarian Party is, in a way, some certain aspects, Nicholas Swarzak. I mean, what So the leaking towards that happens well in all movements. So in that regard, Moldbug's idea that progressivism is the ruling ideology of the ruling elites, I would say, remains to be true. And it could have been true in certain libertarian circles, the mainstream ones. So that's one of the reasons why I picked Chomsky there. As far as Moldbug is concerned, and this goes to me the central how to improve the world question, or how to keep the world from getting worse, or how to have less bad situations. Just less bad, not perfect. This goes back to the sort of model of freedom. Chomsky has a very pure model of freedom. But how about we just have less bad? Well, based on a standard view, Michael Malice was asked this by Patterson in Pursuit, or Steve Patterson, about he was asking some worldview questions like, why do you think North Korea is a bad place to live? Well, he said, look, it's just sort of obvious. And this reminds me of Robert Nozick, the libertarian's denunciation of slavery. It's like, very few people advocate for slavery. Maybe Aristotle did, but he advocated for benevolent slavery. And this sort of cuts to me into the sort of heart of the issue. Is socialism a theory of benevolent slavery? That's what Orwell ends up seeming to say that it is, which by empirical standards, it arguably isn't. Socialism is terrible in empirical standards. You can sort of run these sort of test cases. You don't need some a priori analysis. You could just look at East and West Germany. Where would you rather live? There are a few people that move back there. But in general, the oligarchy or less bad system you choose is that one. Now, interesting, our current society might start trending tyrannical too. So in that regard, you get people moving back. So in this regard, I would say I'd pick those two thinkers because I think they get into the debate over what ruling power allows the most freedom. And Moldbug, in his interview with Thaddeus Russell, had a great example to describe his theory of government. His theory of government is basically balancing a telephone pole on a pencil point. And it is true you can balance a very heavy object on a very small point. But once it starts to fall, you're going to need a lot of strength to prop it up or buttress it. And buttress is a perfect word that comes from cathedrals. The cathedral starts to fall, you have to buttress it. So you can hold it with not a lot of strength. You can hold a lot of weight. But it starts to fall down and starts to decay. You need to rebuild it. In this regard, both Chomsky and Moldbug, I'd argue, are nihilists in a way. Chomsky, after all, I said he's a secular person, and both of them, I would say, are nihilistic. Now, Moldbug's more explicit about nihilistic, which is why Moldbug is actually more enjoyable to listen to in that regard. He's not this sort of puritanical hack, which in some ways Chomsky at times resembles, which it's like, one criticism Keith Preston was that he's not willing to save the world and cry about it. Well, I think Moldbug in that regard, the right is the only group that has humor. The left has this sort of puritanical zeal, which Chomsky is clearly a part of. And Chomsky's role is quite interesting. As I stated earlier, he ends up being in times a defender of the Biden regime. He's actually one of the best defenders of it. Like in that regard, he's the person that his functionary role ends up arguably being is whitewashing the worst aspects of it to get idealistic young social democrats to vote for a 70-year-old senator from Delaware who's been in government for 48 years, which I think is rather remarkable, that this sort of pure anarcho-syndicalist would be able to do that, and would be able to do that on a podcast full of leftists. That's where he made his speech. So Swithin, what do you make of my comments regarding, the Chomsky's drift, as well as Chomsky's pure view of freedom as opposed to Moldbug's, I'd argue, practical. In this regard, that Moldbug is a Burkean. This goes back to the Burke versus Paine debate. I'd argue it's more of a practical pragmatic, which libertarianism, I'd say, is better at doing, in that sense. It's more, and since oftentimes libertarians get diluted saying private power, you get saying, well, you just advocate a private power. It seems like all systems are just private power, as Orwell points out in his theory of oligarchical communism. So, Swithin, what do you make of it?
I would say there's always, I suppose power is always private insofar as, well, the only people who can wield power are individuals, and by necessity that is sort of private actors. They may be doing it in public, as it were, but there isn't really power of a great multitude. Primarily because you simply can't coordinate them, and even if you could coordinate them, you don't have the interest of the members to actually do anything. This is why. So this is a classic argument as to why you can pass legislation which enriches a few people and makes a lot of people a little worse off, because there's lots of people. So I suppose you put taxes up slightly to give a great subsidy to, I don't know, a solar panel producer. All the taxpayers, there's loads of them, and they can't really coordinate very easily in their opposition, and individually it doesn't really cause them any problems. Well, because their tax go up by, say, like $10. Well, that's annoying, but is it really worth campaigning about? Probably not. Whereas obviously the guy who's going to receive the subsidy, which might be in the millions, it's perfectly in his interest, or the group of people there, to coordinate. So I think when it comes to sort of getting things done, as it were, or utilizing power in reality, you've got to be able to coordinate, and you've got to have the motivation. And it tends to be the case that as you get more people involved, the motivation of each individual goes down, because typically the benefits or the costs are more dispersed, and so there's less individual incentive for them to do anything. Whereas if you have a small group, and then of course that would be easier to do, because the spoils are split up. There's greater spoils for each individual, and of course there's less people, so you can coordinate. So that on slavery, interestingly, Taleb says that being employed is basically slavery, but he doesn't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I don't think he goes as far as Walter Block to say that the only problem with slavery was that you couldn't leave. But I remember Taleb actually saying that waged employment is basically a form of slavery, because you're there waiting on hand and foot your boss, and doing as you see fit. Onto the notions of freedom, I think that's an interesting point you make. The left very much, and Chomsky I think shows this with his support implicitly for the corporate elite, is that he thinks that a freedom in kind of a positive, in a much more positive sense, that is, we need to create the conditions in which individuals can fulfill their potential. And so what this might require is you say, the sort of is socialism like the benevolent slaveholder? In a way, it is. And I know other leftists who basically talk about this. Well, what they really want is kind of a state which will provide basic income for everybody, so that they can basically do what they want. And even if they do worse, then they're not down on having no money at all and having to change their attitudes such that they can work for someone for some to be paid. You don't want to go down that level, because that's going to get to coercive power of the employer. So that makes sense in some respects of Chomsky. And also, Chomsky doesn't necessarily hold this, but other leftists do. In addition to just sort of giving them money, what they want to do is, well, people are only free if they make the right decisions. And therefore, we know how best to make the right decisions. And so then you get things like nudge policy. What was that guy called? Cass Sunstein, who was an advisor to Obama, etc. And this kind of goes into the general leftist and progressive mindset. I say particularly the progressive more than anything else. Carson, I would be surprised if he would agree with that, because he seems much more of the individualist than does Chomsky to some extent. And obviously Carson would be in favour of sort of subsidies, as it were. But the mindset is similar. Whereas, as you say, Moldbug's is much more sort of negative in its words. Like, well, just leave people alone. Let people do as they see fit. Now, whether that's, it's a semantic dispute over what really freedom is, but I think a better way of framing it is you would have a better society if you just left people alone primarily, rather than rather than trying to really alter the foundations of society so that any individual can sort of flourish, as it were. That is more of the Chomskyan position. Circling back to private power, I mean, this is I think the big difference between Moldbug and Chomsky. I think Chomsky has the idea that you could actually have democratic rule. I think he thinks that. I think he thinks you could have a whole group of people coming together and engaging in decision making to run society in a certain way. Whereas Moldbug goes, well, that's clearly impossible. And because it's not possible, then he takes the Chomskyan view that, well, what you need to do is to have private power, but it being explicit. In a way, Moldbug's view is similar to that of David Friedman's. David Friedman once said, well, how would you describe the system you're advocating? And he said competitive dictatorship, which was, everybody's the dictator of their own firm, and, you can go to that firm and go to another one. And so you have competition between dictators, effectively, and the Friedmanite position, which to some extent is similar to Moldbug's joint stock, small country idea, where it'd be run like a corporation. I can't remember some of the details, and it's run basically by a CEO, but there's lots of them. And so different people, if they like, California Co., they can go there. If they don't like it, they can leave. And in a sense, it's similar to sort of Hans Hoppe's view of, well, even if we can't get anarcho-capitalism, well, let's just have a Europe made up of countries the size of Liechtenstein and Monaco, so that if you don't like it, you can leave easily. For reference point here of interest, Monaco, Liechtenstein, and Andorra small, I think. Monaco and Liechtenstein are about 30,000 population, so that they are pretty small. In the grand scheme of things, and much smaller than many cities or towns for that matter. So in the joint stocks company, with the recognition of private power, you just need to know who's in power in Moldbug's position. And if you know who's in power, you can hold them accountable, which again is similar to Hoppe's view as to why monarchy is better than democracy. One of Hoppe's arguments is, well, the monarch's rule. Okay, it's his fault. Something's gone wrong. Blame the monarch. Whereas in democracy, you can't really do that because, well, everybody's in power. Now, Hoppe's view may not be entirely correct in certain respects, because many people may have historically thought that the king was ordained by God, and so a lot of the criticism go to his advisors rather than the king himself. Nevertheless, there's still a much more concentrated group of people whom you think you can blame, which you can't do in the same way if you have, at least ostensibly, a democracy in the way that we currently have them. So yes, I would agree that Moldbug's view is more realistic, and in particular, it recognizes the dynamics of actual power of groups much better than Chomsky does.
Yeah, Chomsky has I would argue, a pie in the sky, and it's not only pie in the sky. I'd really like to ask, what would be attributes, or you take the sort of Thomas Aquinas via negativity approach, what would be the what wouldn't be the case in a free society that you would advocate? What wouldn't exist? Would marriages exist? Would sports games exist where there are losers? What wouldn't be the case? So in that regard, whether even via negativity wise it could be defined is unclear. You can always say, why lack imagination? Where I think Orwell's imagination to describe the tyranny of what actual existing socialist societies, which of course, as I explained, with the way in which these sort of narco-syndicalists always leak toward this sort of Stalinness, and then which then in a strange way becomes these sort of hyper-reactionary conservative monarchies, in the case of Cuba or North Korea, which again have some progressive zeal to it, some progressive zeal and progressive aesthetics to it. And as Sean Gabb pointed out, some of the architecture is quite neat. I agree. I mean, some of the railway stations are quite neat. I would agree with that. But nonetheless, in practice, it seems like it's just another system of private power. It's not clear that the coal miners that had to dig out underneath Chernobyl that were done in the HBO series on Chernobyl had that much freedom. It's not clear like they had some easy choice to live. They didn't get compensated for a lot of money. There's a lot of I would argue I'd rather serve on an American nuclear submarine than a Russian nuclear submarine. I'd rather live near 3 Mile Island than I'd rather live near Chernobyl. And actually, so in that regard, it just functions like an oligarchy, and actually functions as a worse oligarchy in that regard than. And actually, there's sort of a strange interplay that works. Tsar Nicky in Russia basically sold out most of his power after 1905. Was basically, this is a historical question that arranged the sort of kaleidoscope of history problem. But he had the amount of power that the Tsar Nicky had was decreasing actually, and it was actually the sort of, the parliamentary state started to play a role, and various other actors as well. And you're worth pointing out that they might have criticized the advisors. He views the king as a kind of god. The king was perfect. The advisors were the problem. But I would still argue then there is still more of an identifiable group which you can hold accountable or not hold accountable. And this is where the we word comes in problem. We, the people, we's democracy. We as in we all decide to do this. Well, what about the people who don't decide? Can democracy exist? I spent 3 years in a sort of not I would say elite, but I would say a private school that had studying political science, and in particular my topic of choice was on democracy. I spent the last hour trying to figure out what democracy is in a paper. I got the stamp to say that I have a degree, but I still think that in general, political science here in the United States is a faulty field because they can't define the word democracy. What exactly is it? What exactly is a country that is democracy? If you can't define what a country is democracy, I don't want to hear anything about these democratic peace theories. Moldbug might say that early 1800s United States was a democracy, but Chomsky clearly wouldn't. Who couldn't vote in early 1800s United States? I'll list a lot of people: women, slaves, new immigrants. There's huge restrictions on who could vote in early 1800s United States. So in that regard, Chomsky would clearly say that current United States is not a democracy. There's also these sort of tin pot type elections that happen all over where they have one candidate. I mean, this is the criticism that the sort of American style liberals will throw at Putin. Well, they'll say, well, Putin won every election. Putin is elected democratically, but he's clearly controls lots of apparatuses that comes up. Actually, the president of Kazakhstan would say the same thing. He said that, look, American had a period of dictatorship too. So this is the leader of Kazakhstan. And actually, South Korea had a period of dictatorship before it got into semi-democracy too. So they can't really define what democracy is on a macro or micro level. As we've stated earlier, I think a family could devote to go out to where to eat, to restaurants. I think those type of things can be decided democratically. The democracy debate, I say, is also, and this goes back to my early episode I did on Protestantism regarding Moldbug, has a problem. And this is like, what exactly are the presbyters and so forth to vote on? Now, if you're going to vote on, what should you make the building out of? Well, I mean, this in some ways is an expert thing, but in some ways it's just an aesthetic, useless decision. Then everyone should vote, or a lot of people vote. But on actual, does the Bible condone, or does it say it's a positive good on homosexual or relations or divorce? I mean, this to me is not if you really think about this, and this goes back to freedom this was one of the Machiavellians. Freedom is defenders of truth. Freedom is truth. So what exactly is true, and to say that is the kind of thing that is true. This is not a matter up for a vote, and Chomsky would agree that this is not a vote that what occurred in the past. Just because you go to certain communities, you could probably find that the Holocaust didn't happen. Would Chomsky think that just because 9/10 of a community said that the Holocaust didn't happen, that it didn't happen? No, Chomsky would clearly not say that. And I could check other questions, but I'm just using an example for the left-leaning people to demonstrate the point that about democracy being the the truth there. But nonetheless, I would say that democracy has a problem of that not being defined, and it's quite clear that it doesn't. There's all sorts of wrong answers that you get. This goes back to the goodness of people. I was talking about the Protestantism. What exactly is disputing of it? John Calvin thought he was right. He thought he had a perfect view on it. Perfect view on it. And this is where I was talking about Protestantism. This comes up in sort of the argumentation culture that Protestants have about debating Scripture and debating what to do and then how they should live it out. And this again, I'm an advocate of competitive dictatorships, which is, I've stated before, I'm somewhat of a David Friedman type libertarian in that regard. But this is where Chomsky, I would argue, is his own version of his oligarchy. Now, Keith Preston, I would argue, has a pure version of anarchism by being a pan-anarchist. If Commune X wants to have slavery, or what Chomsky or some Kevin Carson would term as slavery, let's say they have a corporation, it's really effective at producing things, but they have to do it in a real inhuman way. I mean, if the workers want to decide to do that, and you ask the workers, do you like this? And they say yes. And you could say, well, they're being propagandized. But at some point, to me, this becomes like an eye test problem where it's true. I mean, they enjoy doing it. They're free. They view themselves. We shouldn't intervene. We shouldn't intervene. And not only we shouldn't intervene, intervention causes harm. And again, and this is where I argue the left has a problem with democracy. And supporting the American progressive elite for wars of adventure or wars of changing society. So those are my broad overview of comments regarding issues of democracy. And I would say that Chomsky and Moldbug sort of get at the heart of the debate of what exactly is democracy? Do we have it? And is it desirable? So within any final comments or general comments on those understandings, we should start wrapping it up. Swithin?
I do think it's ironic when it comes to Chomsky and most of the left, is that they will advocate, so we have democracy, so everyone has a say and everybody can join in and make their feelings known to society. And because if we would have like even competitive dictatorship or monarchy or traditional systems, that's hierarchical, that's privilege, etc., etc., etc. However, especially with the progressive left, which Chomsky clearly is, they are hugely fond of elites, despite their protestations otherwise, which was clearly brought out by Brexit and Trump's vote in 2016. They would go about how we should have democracy and the people should decide, and then when the people decide things that they don't like, they then go, well, the people, we can't expect people to understand these sorts of things. And so they are either schizophrenic and don't realize it, or they're very Machiavellian. You could choose either. Yes, on the one hand, the people should decide, everybody, actually no, just the elite should decide. Whereas Moldbug and not everybody on the right necessarily would advocate, but a lot of older style thoughts about sort of ruling and stuff. Well, the king rules, but it doesn't mean he controls everything. He's the privileged, he's the king, but then he can leave other people to do as they see fit to a large extent. I think was this Moldbug or one rightist theorist said once you've got sort of the leader has sort of secure power base and no one can sort of usurp him. And in general, he'll aggrandize himself, but he'll leave most people alone. This was certainly true of Franco in Spain. My uncle lived under Franco in Spain. Apparently, dictator, left most people alone, did what they want. As long as you didn't annoy Franco directly, he'd leave you alone. And this is sort of the irony of the two camps. One, you could say that Moldbug is sort of elitist and Chomsky isn't. But actually, when it comes to who is likely to have more decision-making power over their own life, it's likely much more to be the guy living in Moldbugville than Chomskyville. Now, of course, then you revert back to the whole freedom arguments. But at least if you think about the relative influence of self-described elites in both systems, those in the Moldbug system, the elites have less direct control, even though they may have more explicit power. Now, whether that's a feature, whether it's a bug, I think it worth noting. I mean, another example would be the whole coronavirus stuff. I know, listen to the science, listen to the priests, because the priests will tell us the answer of how we should all, be locked in our houses all day. And this is from self-described democratic people. And it's interesting, actually. It hasn't happened yet, I don't think, but there is actually a vote in Switzerland on various lockdown restrictions. I don't know if that's happened yet. If it has, I haven't heard the result. But that would be a potentially interesting. Outcome. Although it would be more interesting if they voted on the introduction of them to begin with, rather than the continuation. Yes. On the face of it, the view of kind of Machiavellian Moscow, etc., is much more kind of elitist and focused on elite theory. But in practice, I think it's significantly less elite orientated than sort of the Chomskyan left.
Yes, I would agree that the seeming juxtaposition of the two thinkers is one is that way and the other way is this way. But if you dig deeper, arguably they're both that way. And Chomsky clearly dabbled in what is known as Scientism, or the rule by managerial expert elite, which then comes problems when people cite Chomsky as an advocate of workplace democracy, because many people say, well, this is a better form of management, this better form of rule or whatever. So this is more just me just throwing dirt at the Chomskyites rather than making somewhat sophisticated argument. But there's a bit of a mudslinging there. And of course, as far as democracy is concerned, when you get the wrong answers, or a certain group gets the wrong answers, you come up with all sorts of problems. And this came up in his debate with Foucault. Foucault pointed out, as far as family structure is concerned, is that most actual functioning Marxists are like fairly conservative bourgeois style families. Now, interestingly, and Orwell points out in 1984 in its theory, oligarchic communism, like on the one hand, they seek the abolishment of the state, although the state views itself as Big Brother, which is a sort of familial relationship. So do they seek to abolish or not to seek to abolish it? Well, this is where I think the Chomskyites just don't have as much practical experience, and it's worth pointing out Chomsky himself lives, as Charles Murray and would point out, and he himself is a married man. He's in some ways lives a fairly, he works for MIT, which for being an anti-war activist is somewhat interesting. And I would argue he is part of the elite, although he's on the fringe of it. But I do think his support of Biden is quite interesting and quite enjoyable to watch him sell out for Biden. So overall, thanks for doing this conversation, Smith. And I do think it's interesting to juxtapose these two thinkers. There's other books that do this. There's other lectures that done that. Burke versus Paine, the Great Debate. And in that regard, I'd put Moldbug in the Burke category and Chomsky in the Paine category. So we not actually get them here, and I actually think it would actually be somewhat boring if the two of them actually debated. But nonetheless, thanks for doing this talk, Swithin.
I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with your friends and family. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the rankings, and the more people can enjoy this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, any comments, criticisms, or otherwise, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.